cabin cost me $412,000, and I paid every cent of it myself. I want to say that clearly because later, when everything fell apart, there were people in my family who seemed to have forgotten that fact entirely, my brother among them. I signed the paperwork on a Thursday in early October. The attorney's office smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I remember sitting there at that long oak table thinking about how Ruth would have laughed at the whole thing. She always said I was too careful with money, that I researched every purchase like it was a doctoral thesis. She wasn't wrong. I'd spent 11 months looking at properties before I found the cabin. 11 months of weekend drives up into the Virginia mountains, of walking through damp kitchens and poking at sagging porch railings, of driving back home alone and making notes in a yellow legal pad I kept on the passenger seat. Ruth passed in February. Pancreatic cancer. She was 61 years old, and she was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to the end. We'd been married 34 years. The cabin was her idea, or the idea of a cabin was hers. We used to talk about it, someplace in the mountains after I retired, somewhere with a wood stove and a porch that faced west so we could watch the light change in the evenings. She had a picture she'd cut from a magazine years ago and kept tucked in the drawer of her nightstand. A log cabin somewhere in autumn, maple trees all orange and gold, a gray curl of smoke from the chimney. I found it when I was cleaning out her things. I kept it. I retired from civil engineering in June, 14 months after she died. 40 years of bridges and road systems and flood mitigation projects, and then one morning I cleaned out my desk, shook a few hands, and drove home to a house that was too quiet. I stayed there through the summer. I wasn't ready to do anything yet. But by September I started making those drives again, and by October I'd found the place. It sat on 6 acres in Augusta County. A 2-bedroom cabin with a covered porch, facing west across a meadow toward a ridgeline of old hardwoods. Stone fireplace, wide plank pine floors. A loft with a small reading chair someone had left behind. The nearest town was 8 miles down the mountain. I could sit on that porch at 4 in the afternoon and watch the shadows move across the ridge for an hour without a single sound except the wind and the occasional hawk. I wasn't looking for an investment. I wasn't looking for anything except somewhere to be quiet and get through whatever this next part of life was going to be. My brother called 3 weeks after I closed. His name is Gordon. He's 4 years younger than me, lives outside of Richmond with his wife and his son, and he has spent most of his adult life in a state of low-grade financial anxiety that expresses itself as confidence. He always has a plan, always has an angle, always has a scheme that is just about to come together. Growing up, I was the responsible one, the one who read the fine print. Gordon was the one who shook hands on things and figured out the details later. He called on a Sunday evening, which should have been my first sign. Gordon calls on Sunday evenings when he wants something. "I heard you bought a place up in the mountains," he said, like he'd heard a rumor rather than the fact that I'd told him myself 2 weeks prior. "I did," I said. "Marcus told me it's really something." Marcus was his son, my nephew, 28 years old and newly married to a woman named Terry. I had shown them photos when they came over for Thanksgiving preparations at my sister's house. Marcus had seemed interested. He'd asked a lot of questions about square footage and road access. "It's a good property," I said. "That's great. That's really great." A pause. "You know, Marcus has been doing pretty well lately. That renovation business he and Terry started is picking up." Marcus and Terry had started flipping houses about 2 years prior. From what I'd heard, they'd done 2 properties and were working on a third. I was glad for them. I told Gordon so. "Well," Gordon said, "the thing is, they've been talking about expanding, getting into short-term rentals. And when Marcus saw your cabin, he had some ideas." I waited. A mountain cabin like that. You know what those go for on Airbnb? Especially fall foliage season, around hunting season? You're sitting on a serious income stream. "I'm not interested in renting it," I said. "Well, hear me out. You're not going to be up there all the time. You live here in town, you've got the house. The cabin just sits empty most of the year." "Gordon, Marcus would handle everything. You wouldn't have to do a single thing. He'd manage the bookings, the cleaning crew, all of it. You'd get a cut of the revenue." "I bought it to live in," I said. "Part of the year, at least. And to have it, it's not an investment property. You paid over $400,000 for a place you're going to sit in alone and watch birds. I didn't say anything to that. I'm just saying there's a smarter way to use an asset like that, Gordon said. Ruth would have. Don't, I said. Don't finish that sentence. A silence. Then I'm just trying to help. I appreciate the call, I said, but my answer's no. I thought that was the end of it. I spent most of November up at the cabin. I brought a box of Ruth's books, the photograph from her nightstand, the old wool blanket we'd had since our first apartment. I split firewood most mornings. I drove into town on Tuesdays for groceries. I cooked simple things, soup, eggs, whatever was easy, and ate at the small table by the window that looked out at the meadow. In the evenings, I built a fire and read, where I just sat. Some nights I talked to Ruth, which I know is not a thing that does anything practical, but there's a difference between knowing that and not doing it anyway. December, I went back to my house in town for the holidays. My daughter Faye drove up from Charlotte with her husband and the kids. My sister came. It was fine. It was careful and loving, and everyone tried hard, the way the first holiday after a loss always is. I went back up to the cabin in late January. It was on that second trip that I noticed something off. Small things at first. A kitchen cabinet door not quite closed the way I left it. A chair angled differently than I remembered. I'm an engineer by habit. I notice when things aren't where they're supposed to be. I walked through both rooms twice, slowly, and nothing was missing, nothing was damaged. But the space had a feeling to it that I couldn't shake, the feeling of someone else having been in it. I checked the locks. Both were original hardware, nothing forced. I had given a spare key to exactly one person, my brother Gordon, when I first bought the place, in case of emergency. I called him. "Did you go up to the cabin?" I asked. A beat too long. Marcus went up to take a look. Just a quick look. No big deal. I gave him the key. He wanted to see the layout. I didn't give you that key so you could let other people in. He's family. Gordon, that is my home. You don't send people into my home without asking me. You're overreacting. He didn't touch anything. That key, I said, needs to come back to me. And Marcus needs to understand that he is not to go up there again. Gordon told me I was being dramatic. I told him I'd be down to collect the key the following weekend. When I went to get it, Marcus was there at Gordon's house sitting in the kitchen, and he looked at me with this expression I still think about. Not embarrassed, not apologetic, just slightly impatient, like I was the one causing a problem. "I just wanted to see the potential," he said. "You've got a property that could generate $8,000–$10,000 a month during peak season. That's serious money." "I know how much it could generate," I said. "I'm not interested." "Why not? You live alone. You've got a $400,000 property sitting empty half the year." "It's not empty. I'm there." "You're there a couple months a year." "I own it," I said. That's the end of the conversation. Terry was there too, leaning against the counter. She said, pleasantly, "We really do have a great system. Our guests have wonderful reviews. You'd barely know anyone had been there." I picked up the key from the table where Gordon had set it. I said goodbye. I drove home. I changed the lock that same week, both doors. February was quiet. I heard nothing from Gordon or Marcus. I told myself it was over, that they'd moved on to the next idea. I went back up to the cabin for 2 weeks in March, and it was exactly as I'd left it. The books on the shelves, Ruth's photograph on the side table, the wool blanket folded on the arm of the chair. I sat on the porch in the cold mornings with a cup of coffee and watched the deer come out into the meadow at first light. 3 of them, most mornings. I named the biggest one after my foreman from 30 years ago, a fact I did not share with anyone. The call came in April. Not from Gordon this time, from my sister Norma, who called in that careful voice she uses when she has news she doesn't want to deliver. "I got a call from Alice Beaumont," Norma said. Alice Beaumont was a woman I barely knew. Her husband had done some work for Gordon years ago. She said she booked a mountain cabin in Augusta County through some rental site, and when she went to look up the address, she realized she recognized it from photos I'd posted on Facebook at Thanksgiving. I sat down in my kitchen chair. "She called me to ask if the property was a legitimate rental," Norma continued. "She paid a deposit, $80. When is her booking? I asked. Memorial Day weekend. I didn't raise my voice. I sat very still in my kitchen and I asked Norma to forward me Alice Beaumont's contact information. Then I thanked her and hung up. I had already, 3 weeks earlier, called an attorney. I want to be specific about this because it matters to the rest of what happened. After the incident with the key, after Marcus had gone into my cabin without my permission and then sat in his father's kitchen looking at me like I was being unreasonable, I had called an attorney named Gilbert Crouch who had handled some property matters for me in the past. I told him the situation. He told me to document everything, the original lock change, the conversation with Gordon, anything in writing. He sent a formal letter on my behalf to both Gordon and Marcus in March, stating clearly that the property at the Augusta County address was my private residence, that I had not authorized any rental agreement, management agreement, or access agreement of any kind, and that any unauthorized use of the property or representation of the property for commercial purposes would constitute fraud and trespass and would be pursued accordingly. Gordon called me after the letter arrived, furious. I told him I hadn't wanted to do it that way, but that they'd left me no choice. He hung up. Marcus did not respond to the letter at all. Now I had Alice Beaumont's deposit receipt and a booking confirmation showing her arrival date for a cabin I owned. I called Gilbert Crouch that evening. Then I called the Augusta County Sheriff's Office and spoke with the deputy named Ray Callum, explained the situation, and provided Gilbert's contact information. Deputy Callum was professional and thorough. He looked up the rental listing while I was on the phone. It was active on 3 platforms. The profile listed the host as a property management company called Ridge and Valley Stays. I had never heard of Ridge and Valley Stays. A quick search showed it had been registered as an LLC in Virginia 4 months earlier. One of the registered agents was Marcus. There were 7 bookings listed in the system for the coming summer. Total revenue represented just over $11,000. Deposits had been collected on 4 of them. I asked Deputy Callum what my options were. He explained them carefully. Given the attorney's letter sent in March, which established that Marcus had been formally notified, the unauthorized listings constituted fraud. The collection of deposits from guests made it wire fraud. He said this was not a civil matter in the way that a simple trespass might be. He said I should not contact Marcus directly. He said to let things proceed. I will be honest. There was a part of me that did not want to do this. Marcus is my nephew. I watched him learn to ride a bicycle in his parents' driveway. I was at his wedding. There was a version of this situation where I could have simply gotten him to take the listings down and refund the deposits, and we would have had a very bad family dinner conversation and moved on. But I had already tried the conversation. I tried it the night Gordon first called. I tried it when I drove down to get the key. I tried it in the kitchen with Marcus sitting across from me explaining patiently that the property was mine and that I had no interest in renting it. He had heard me every single time, and he had gone ahead anyway. Some people only hear one kind of no. I did not change my plans. Memorial Day weekend, I drove up to the cabin as I normally would have. I brought groceries, the new novel I'd been meaning to start, a good bottle of wine that I planned to open on Sunday evening. I arrived on the Friday morning and I built a small fire because the mountain mornings were still cold, and I sat on my porch and read for 3 hours. Around 2 in the afternoon, a white SUV came up the gravel drive. I watched it from the porch chair. It parked, and a man in his mid-40s got out, then a woman, then 2 children, then another man, a friend, I guessed, or a relative, who was on his phone. They stood in the drive looking at the cabin, the man pointing at the porch, the children already moving toward the meadow. I set down my book. I walked to the porch railing, and I said quietly, "Can I help you?" The man looked up, startled. "Oh, hey, we have a booking here. Memorial Day weekend." "I'm afraid you don't," I said. "This is my home. I own it. I don't rent it." He pulled out his phone and showed me the confirmation screen. I looked at it, recognized the listing format, and I said, "I understand you paid a deposit, and I'm sorry about that. I have not authorized any rentals of this property. The person who listed it did not have my permission to do so, and you should contact your payment method to dispute the charge." The woman looked at her husband. One of the children had stopped at the edge of the porch steps. "We drove 4 hours," the man said. "I know," I said. "I'm genuinely sorry. That's not something I caused, but I understand it's a serious inconvenience. I had Gilbert's card in my shirt pocket. I gave it to them. This is my attorney. He can help you pursue the fraud claim. A few minutes later, a second car came up the drive. Different family. 3 adults and a teenager. Deputy Callum had told me to call when the guests arrived. I had called him from inside the cabin before I came out to the porch. He and a second deputy arrived about 12 minutes later. Marcus arrived about 7 minutes after that. He had, apparently, planned to be there. I think he expected to play the role of host, to let the guests in, to present the cabin as though everything were perfectly normal and the management was simply a done deal. He pulled in and found 2 sheriff's vehicles, 2 confused families standing in the drive with their luggage, and me sitting back on the porch with my book. I watched his face go through several things. Deputy Callum walked over to his car before Marcus had fully gotten out of it. I heard some of what was said. I heard Marcus say there must be a misunderstanding, and I heard Deputy Callum say, very patiently, that there was a formal attorney's letter on file and multiple counts of unauthorized collection of funds. Terry had come with him. She stayed in the car. The deputies did not arrest Marcus that day at the property. What happened was a formal report, a summons, and a process that went on for several months and involved not just the fraud related to the cabin listings, but an audit of Ridge and Valley stays that turned up 2 other properties that had been listed without clear owner authorization. I don't know the details of those. That wasn't my matter. What I know is what Gilbert told me over the following months, that Marcus entered a guilty plea on reduced charges in exchange for full restitution to the affected guests, a significant fine, and the dissolution of the LLC. The plea also required him to have no further contact with me or my property. Gordon called me once, about 3 weeks after Memorial Day. He said I had destroyed his son's life. He said I could have handled it privately like family. He said Ruth would have been ashamed of me. I let him finish. Then I said, I gave Marcus every chance to stop. I gave you every chance to stop him. The attorney's letter went to both of you. I tried the private route. What Marcus did wasn't a misunderstanding. He took deposits from real people for a property he didn't own. You can be angry at me if that's easier, but you know what he did? Gordon didn't say anything to that. I said, I'd like you to not call me for a while. I mean that without anger. I just need some time. He hung up. That was 8 months ago. I haven't heard from him since. Faye came up to visit in September, just her and me, no kids that weekend. We sat on the porch the first evening and watched the light come off the ridge the way it does in autumn. That long, slanted gold light that Ruth loved, the kind that turns everything warm for about 40 minutes before the dark comes. Faye had a cup of tea. I had a beer. We didn't talk about Gordon or Marcus. We talked about her kids, about a trip she was planning, about whether I was sleeping all right and eating enough, the way she always does. At some point she said, Mom would have liked it up here. Yes, I said, she would have. We watched the light move down the ridge until it was gone, and then we went inside and I made dinner. I think about it sometimes. What Gordon said about me watching birds alone and wasting an asset. Maybe from the outside that's what it looks like, an old man on a mountain with his dead wife's books and a blanket and a chair. But Ruth and I talked about this place for 15 years before I found it. Every time the idea came up, she'd say, someday. And someday kept getting pushed back because there was always something. The kids, the mortgage, the next project at work. We thought we had time. We thought there would be a right moment that wasn't quite yet. You learn things about time when it runs out on you without warning. I'm sitting on the porch as I write this. It's November now. The maples are past peak. But there are still some gold leaves in the upper canopy. And there's a cold front moving through that's turned the sky this particular shade of gray I've come to associate with the mountain in late fall. The fire is going inside. I have nowhere I need to be until Thursday. I didn't buy this place to generate revenue. I didn't buy it to be sensible about asset allocation. I bought it because it was the last promise I made to someone I loved, and I intend to keep it as long as I'm able. No one gets to take that from me. Not my nephew, not my brother, Not anyone who looks at this meadow and sees only what it's worth on a weekend booking platform. Some things aren't for rent. I keep thinking about that moment on the porch when the white SUV came up the drive. The children spilling out, the man pointing at the meadow, all of them expecting a vacation that someone had sold them without owning the right to sell it. None of them were the problem. They were just the final proof of one. What happened with Marcus wasn't complicated when I look at it honestly. He heard me say no 3 times, received a formal letter from an attorney, and went ahead anyway. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice, and choices like that don't happen in a vacuum. They happen when someone has learned, over years, that the people around them will eventually yield. Gordon spent decades bending rules and shaking hands on things he hadn't fully thought through, and nobody made him sit with the consequences. Marcus grew up watching that. He learned that boldness gets rewarded, and that persistence wears people down. He wasn't wrong as a general rule, he was just wrong about me. I don't say that with pride. I say it because I think it matters to understand where consequences actually come from. Marcus didn't lose his business and his marriage because I reported him. He lost those things because he committed fraud against real people, collected their money, and assumed no one would do anything about it. The outcome followed directly from the action. I just declined to stand in the way of it. There's something I've been turning over since all of this settled. My whole career was built on a simple principle. If you don't do the calculation correctly, the structure fails. It doesn't fail because the math is unfair. It fails because reality doesn't negotiate. I spent 40 years applying that principle to concrete and steel, and it turns out it applies equally to the way you treat people and the choices you make when you think no one is paying attention. Marcus had intelligence. He was sharp. He could see angles. He could build a plan. What he didn't have was the moral backbone to apply that intelligence honestly. And without that, the intelligence just becomes a more efficient way to dig a hole. I think about the energy he put into creating that LLC, listing those properties, managing those booking platforms, all of it aimed sideways instead of forward. It genuinely saddens me. What I know is this: the moments that test your character aren't the big dramatic ones. They're the small ones where you've been told no, and the person who said it isn't watching, and you have to decide what kind of person you actually are when it costs you something to be good. Marcus failed that test not once, but repeatedly, over months, with clear warnings at every step. I passed mine by sitting still on a porch with a book and waiting for what I'd already set in motion. Faye asked me last September, watching the light come off the ridge, whether I felt bad about how it ended. I told her I felt bad about a lot of things. I felt bad that Gordon and I haven't spoken. I felt bad that the families who drove 4 hours. I felt bad for the younger version of Marcus, who learned the wrong lessons early and never got corrected. But I don't feel bad about holding the line. Ruth worked 30 years alongside me to earn the life we built. This cabin was the last thing I promised her. I wasn't going to let anyone turn it into a transaction while I stood quietly aside. Some things you protect not because you're angry, but because they mean too much to let go.